Morgan Stanley, in its latest report, has hailed the economic blueprint of the Modi government and has said that in a short span of 10 years, India has boosted its position in the world order through positive reforms of its macro and market outlook. The report, titled India Equity Strategy and Economics, How India Has Transformed in Less Than a Decade, has predicted that India will emerge as a key driver for Asia and shoulder a fifth of global growth in the next decade. Let me give you an overview of this report. This report states that manufacturing as a percentage of GDP will rise by 5%, that is, by the year 2031. Another highlight has been that there have been broad-based gains across goods and services exports. So that is an important area of growth. The export market share will double to 4.5% by 2031 is what this report is predicting. Per capita income will rise to about $5,200 by financial year, in fact, 2032. There is now a lower volatility in inflation and shallower interest rate cycles as well. Structural transformation has boosted saving investments is what this report is suggesting, and it has gone on to say that share of profits in GDP has doubled from an all-time low in 2020, and the supply side reforms have led to a major rise in investments. There's reliance on global capital market flows has reduced, and there is now a low correlation with oil prices and US recession via macro stability. We are now being joined by our newsmaker, Ridham Desai, who is the MD of Morgan Stanley. Mr. Desai, I really appreciate your time. Your report says that Morgan Stanley ran into significant skepticism about India, particularly with overseas investors who say that India has not delivered its potential despite it being the second fastest growing economy. Why, according to you and your research, what did India do right in the last 9 years, which it did not do earlier?
Yeah, thank you for having me on the show. So lots of things have happened, actually. I think, first of all, and this is a bit technical, India has focused on macro stability. So if I were to use purely from an economic perspective, I would characterize the Prime Minister as an inflation hawk, which essentially means that he doesn't want inflation. And this is very critical for prosperity of the economy. So in order to achieve that outcome, he actually changed the mandate for the central bank. So our Reserve Bank of India is now solely focused on delivering lower inflation outcomes. And the best result of this was seen during the pandemic. While the world at large was facing runaway inflation, countries like US, which normally have sub 2% inflation, experienced 9% inflation. India's inflation rise was very modest. So in part, this was to do with how the RBI's policy was framed, and in part it had to do with how the government actually protected poor people during the pandemic. So instead of doling out cash, which is what a lot of Western hemisphere economies did, India was actually giving food, and that's not inflationary. So that's the first big change. And the seeds of this change was sown in 2013, when the then Federal Reserve Governor Ben Bernanke just set taper, and India's currency was down 20%. And the RBI was in a spot and had to raise interest rates by 200 basis points overnight. So India is no longer in that situation. We call this macro stability. So its macro is far more stable. The second thing that has happened, I think, is how India does social transfers. And I think this is a story that has been missed by headline media in India. And the seeds of this were sown when the Prime Minister decided that we have to accelerate Aadhaar and identify each and every Indian digitally. And India Stack and Aadhaar allows the government to actually make social transfers very efficiently without leakages. Okay. Of course, this was supplemented by enormous effort by the government to open bank accounts for the hitherto unbanked. And now we're able to do these transfers without the age-old leakages, middlemen, corruption. So the intended beneficiaries are getting what they deserve to get. Not only that, the government has actually now also changed some of these things into delivering stuff in kind rather than just cash, because you can't control how people spend cash.
Okay.
Whereas you can send QR codes which pay the fees of your girl child, and that actually achieves desired outcomes. So this is the second big change that I would highlight. Massive improvement in social transfers, which is, I think, directly improving the lives of poor people in India.
Okay.
The third is the change in with respect to macro policy on how the government should interact with corporations. See, ultimately, corporate entities or businesses, I should say, are the ones who invest. When they invest, they create jobs. When they create jobs, you get wages, you get all-round prosperity. It's a virtuous cycle. You can't achieve this by distributing free money and wages to people. It doesn't work that way. That creates inflation. This government is very focused on improving the business viability case for India, and corporate India is back. In fact, multinational companies are back. We run proprietary indicators which suggest that multinational companies' sentiment on India is at all-time highs, and they're investing. And as this investment cycle rolls out, you will see greater prosperity. So I can go on and on, but I think these are the three mega headline changes, which are at the helm of the transformation that the Indian economy is experiencing, and why we are everybody's focus point today. Boards around the world are discussing India, discussing what they should be doing in India, how they should invest, they should access the Indian market, because this is the place where you want to be in the next 10, 20 years.
Yes, and that's quite an explanation. So, Rhythm, really appreciate that. And among the risks that the report has listed, two major factors, including fragmented verdict in 2024 Lok Sabha polls. Is the report then saying that a strong government with majority is imperative for India's growth story currently?
So see, the way I would characterize this is that when you get a coalition government that is run by a minority party, there's a lot of focus on managing the politics, and the economy takes a backseat. When you get a majority government, and this is not always the case, but a majority government has a better chance to focus on the things that the country needs, rather than just working on making the government survive. So that's the importance of delivering a majority verdict. We've seen in the past, India has delivered a few minority governments, and they have not been good economic outcomes in those years. So I think this is, being a democracy, we have to deal with this every 5 years. There's no guarantee of how our voters will show up on the polling booths and vote, but it's a risk, therefore, we have to keep in mind.
Okay, and Morgan Stanley had placed India in fragile 5 a decade back, and now it is the bright spot as it is being seen. Did this report factor in the economic situation in the West, especially the US, and the backdrop of an ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine?
So there's going to be a constant challenge for India. If I make a comparison with China, when China was growing rapidly in the previous 3 decades, it had the benefit of very strong global growth as a tailwind. India may not have that benefit. In large part, this is because the world is aging and because the world is burdened with a lot of debt. So global growth, I suspect, will be a lot slower than it was when China was emerging out of its status as a poor economy into a developing or developed economy. India will have to do a lot more hard work and rely a lot more on its domestic economy. As the Prime Minister calls Atmanirbhar Bharat. I think the context there is that we have to deliver our prosperity using our own economy, rather than just depending on what the world will give us. The world will do a little bit here and there, but it will not be as rosy as it was for China. So that is clearly a risk. You asked about the war. I don't think the war really brings much risk to India. We've managed the crude oil situation quite well. And the intensity of oil to GDP in India is anyway declining, and it will continue to decline. So we will be less reliant on imported oil 10 years from now than we are today, or we were, say, 10 years ago. So that's a lesser risk. But generally speaking, geopolitics is always a concern, and we never know when the next big war happens and what impact that has on the world economy. So as I said, the world will be less cooperative, and we'll have to do our own heavy lifting. But I think we're there. And we have a very strong domestic economy, and it's an economy that a lot of multinational companies want access to. So it's good news for India.
Yes, so that self-reliance or Atmanirbharta is not just a slogan. It is about ensuring that we are able to sail through the crisis which is there all over the world. My last question to you, your report certainly cautions that a sharp rise in commodity prices due to supply outages and shortages in skilled labor supply could alter the outlook. How important are these issues individually, and what should India do to negate this risk?
So we can't do much with commodity prices except increase our domestic production. So we're doing that. Some of the biggest import items on our list are urea, sunflower seeds, palm oil, and a lot of domestication of that capacity will take place over the next 3, 4, 5 years. We will reduce our dependence relative to GDP in oil. So some of these, volatile commodities will have a lower share in our import bill going forward. With respect to labor, I think it's something we need to keep an eye on because skilling of labor, I think, will be largely done in the private sector. But there will be some gaps. There will be gaps in demand and supply. There will be periods when there is very strong demand for skilled labor and we may not be able to supply it. Overall, India, of course, has a very good situation with labor supply. We have amongst the best demographics in the world, so we don't have a problem in terms of quantity. But the quality of labor supply will, I think, be a challenge and will have to be managed. But I think the private sector will do bulk of the heavy lifting there rather than the government. All
right, Rhythm Desai, pleasure speaking to you, MD of Morgan Stanley, giving us details of the report that has been published. Thank you so much. Joining me now is former Executive Director of the IMF, Professor Surjit Bhalla. Professor Bhalla, I appreciate your time. India of today is certainly different from India which was in 2013. I'm going to quote a part of this report which says that in a short span of 10 years, India has gained positions in the world order with significant positive consequences for the macro and market outlook. This is what the Morgan Stanley report is saying. Why is this report significant given that India remains a growth story in the world where recession is lurking?
Absolutely. Look, I've gone through the report and, there isn't much that I disagree with. Indeed, there isn't anything I disagree with. This has been, a long journey for India, and several of us have been documenting the fact that this is a structural change. And a lot of people, or some people, look at it and quarter by quarter numbers, etc., and try and glean something out of it. But this is a mega structural change that has been going on and has accelerated in the last 10 years. Now, what is this structural change? If you look at, and the Morgan Stanley report goes to great lengths to document with a lot of data. Let me take a little time out. What we find is that individuals, experts are often taken to pontificating about the Indian economy without recourse to data. So it's like, I think so, therefore it is so.
Yes.
The Morgan Stanley report is a very significant departure from this tendency to paint the picture as per your ideological or political beliefs. This is a solid, documented report with facts, figures, and no opinions. And the bottom line that comes out is that this is a big structural change. People at the IMF, etc., have also been noting it. The world has been noting it, that we are now the big engine of growth in the world. As you rightly pointed out when you said earlier that in a world facing recession, incidentally, I don't think the world will have a recession. I have consistently been of the view that the world will avoid, the US will avoid. So technically, Europe or Germany has entered into a recession. But I do think the fact that we are at that stage, increasing investments, and the world also now recovering from the shocks, I think the next few years are going to be quite dynamite for India and maybe for some parts of the world as well.
Professor Bhalla, one question that is repeatedly asked is about job creation. What measures do you suggest to address that concern?
Okay, I don't know. I mean, this is one of the fault lines in the Indian public debate that, when in doubt, bring up inflation. And if you're still in doubt, bring up there are not enough jobs. As it happens, I've done some work on it, which is published for the public to see, that we have created jobs upwards of 10 million a year for the last 5 years. So unemployment rate is down to about 6.5%. I'm not citing private data sources, which may show and which do show a much higher unemployment rate. So I honestly do not, you can say that, listen, everybody should be employed. Yes, I would advocate that. But, an unemployment rate of about 6% for a growing economy like ours, and with increased supply of educated individuals coming into the labor force, is nothing to sneeze at. And again, compare, one of the things I keep emphasizing is that, let us not look on the Indian economy as an island. We are not an island. No country is an island today. So therefore, you are affected much more by global forces than you ever were. So let's recognize that. And therefore, if you're talking about jobs, let's look at which country has provided this percentage increase in jobs. We provided much more jobs over the last few years, including post-COVID, obviously post-COVID, than even the US. So, and US, we all say, is a big success in terms of provision of jobs. And when it comes to India, I don't know what data people look at, but really, there is no evidence to suggest that we have an employment problem anymore in India.
Okay, my last question is, from being the fragile five in 2013 to becoming the fastest growing economy in 2022-23, we certainly have traveled a long way. Do you think India really has to overcome the risk of being a Brazil? Because that is often said that our growth story should not really plateau from here on.
Well, if we plateau at 7.5%, 8%, that's not called plateauing. I would certainly not in my book. That's living up to and growing at our potential, perhaps even higher. But, in a world where world economic growth has slowed down, that for us to be growing at 7.5%, 8% is very, very commendable, and something to be respected and something to be admired. I do think we can, remember what we just talked in the beginning about the infrastructure investment.
Yes.
One of the first lessons in economics is that infrastructure investment affects growth with a lag. So we are yet to see the performance when the lag comes in. So, I think 7.5%, 8% is certainly doing brilliantly. And as I said, I have made suggestions about how we can accelerate this growth process, and one of them being through a reduction in direct taxes. One of the things pointed out in this Morgan Stanley report, which I fully agree with, that just look, I remember perhaps even in discussions with you and other TV channels, when the government cut the corporate tax rate in 2019. And everybody was saying, our tax revenues would go down and this and that and whatever. Look at what has happened. It's transformed. And I think the only big area for tax reform, other than sort of GST, lowering taxes in GST, are direct taxes. India needs a significant revision and reform of direct taxes. And then, we'll be asking as to whether 8% is enough. I certainly think we can grow on a sustained basis at something close to 8.5% if we do the reforms that some of the people are recommending.
Professor Sujit Bhalla, always a pleasure to speak to you. Thank you so much for decoding the Morgan Stanley report. That's all from me. We're putting out those interviews on news18.com. I'll be seeing you tomorrow. Thanks so much.